So today we're going to start looking into is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So the cool thing about what we have going on here is we're really going to be looking at something very similar that we saw in chapter 3 when we looked at supply and demand. The main difference is that instead of prices and quantities, we're going to look at a price level, which we talked about last week, or which we talked about on Monday, and we'll look at the real GDP. That is, what's the value of all of our goods produced? That is what we talked about on sometime before spring break. So the cool thing that's going to happen here is everything that we've talked about in this second unit is really just going to come together, and it's really just going to paint a really nice picture of what's going on. So what we look at with this is we start out looking at two different perspectives with our uh, in the macroeconomy. That is, how do economists look at things, and what are the two big prevailing models and two prevailing mindsets that we're going to see come out of this? So that's what this first bit looks at. The second bit, we actually build our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So we actually see what's going on and learn how to interpret that model and so on. Third and fourth looks at shifts in supply and demand. So what causes things to change over time? Today, this week, this past month, there's been a lot going on in terms of that. The fifth part, uh, so after we build our model, we can actually interpret that model, and we'll be able to use this model to tell about what's going on with growth, unemployment, inflation, and so on. And previously, I think I've mentioned a relationship between unemployment and inflation, and in that last little section of this chapter, we'll actually see that. And then the very last bit looks at it just reintroduces those perspectives that we're going to introduce at the start of today. Cool. So when we think about the economy and different mindsets about how the economy works, there are really going to be two main groups that we're often divided into. And one of them is going to suggest that supply is really the thing that drives the economy. So what supply says is the supply side, and we'll kind of dive into them. But first thing says supply side is the most important determinant of the size of the economy. So demand just tags along. So with this, what we may think about is something like innovation, stuff like that, things that you didn't know you needed. So if we think about cell phones, right, and how they've developed over the decades, years, however long we want to call that. Um, Originally, and I was personally in this group where originally when the smartphone came out, I was like, well, why do I need a device that has email and the internet on it? I can just go home and get on the computer or get on a laptop, and then I have all that information. So why do I need it on a phone? Right, and originally that's kind of the mindset that I had. Maybe a lot of other people had that too. But then as we go through time, you realize, oh, those things can do some really cool things. I can have games on them. And today, instead of having to have a phone and then an iPod or an MP3 player, I just have a phone, right? Uh, so as we go through time, we realize, hey, this device that I thought was dumb is actually kind of cool. And we realize that as new things get innovated, that there are things that we need that we didn't. There are things that we want or need that we didn't know we wanted or needed. So that's what the supply side says. The other side of those, though, is the demand side. And what these folks are going to say is they're going to say that look, you can build all the stuff you want, but if people don't have money, if people can't afford the stuff you're building, nobody's going to buy it. And if nobody buys your thing, then your thing doesn't get sold and it just goes to waste. So that's kind of the idea of the demand. Pretty straightforward. Again, if I decide to build so what the demand side basically says is if I put a professional baseball team in Boone, Iowa, they probably wouldn't do that well in terms of economics, just because we're kind of, relatively speaking, we're in the middle of nowhere compared to like New York or any like super large cities. So that's just some things that we can see with both supply and demand side, and we'll kind of dive into each one right now. But one of the important things to notice, or that we want to be aware of, is that we don't have to sit and say, oh, I'm supply side or I'm demand side. We can take what we want from each one. And even as we go through time, we can change our attitudes depending on what the conditions are. So whereas today we're seeing more of a uh, today we have where everyone's sitting at home, you can't really do much other than go to the grocery store. Um, so we're seeing that, right? We can build all we want. We can have whatever we want available, but nobody can go do that stuff. So demand isn't there. And also another thing we're seeing is currently, any type of if you look on any airline's website, you're going to find some really low airfare right now because your infrastructure has to keep going on, but you have a lot of planes that are flying empty. So you're able to get super low airfare, but what good is that low airfare if uh, if I go somewhere and everything at that place is closed? So that's kind of the two sides and the two groups that we're going to look into. And the first one that we're going to look into is called supply side economics. Um, and this supply side. This is more of your free market economics. So free market, let the market do its thing. You'll be happy. So what we're getting into is this idea called Say's law. And what this says basically is the supply creates its own demand. So this comes from kind of two perspectives. This first thing says when a good or service is produced and sold, it represents income to someone. So if I make a good, or if I'm working somewhere, I'm getting paid for making that product. So the idea here is that, again, we want to produce goods because if we produce goods, people have income. If people have income, they can go spend it. When people spend it, other people can afford your goods and so on. Excuse me. So that's what we're looking at this Say's law or supply side economics. And the big group of people that really subscribe to this, they're often called neoclassical economists. So I think that the aggregate supply is going to be what really drives the economy in the long run. And when we think about this from a objective perspective, in general, what we'd expect to see is that people are going to that this is going to be very great for the long run. That is, in the long run, we want to promote innovation. We want to see our aggregate supply increase as we go through time, and it's a good long run emphasis. However, where it sometimes falls short is that in the short run, that is between today and tomorrow, whether it be months, years, we can run into recessions, we can run into depressions, we can run into whatever it is we have going on right now. But we have these times where, great, you can build stuff all you want, but people can't go places, right? So again, we're running into an issue today where what we actually see happening, which is really cool, is factories are being refitted to make other goods. So the big thing going on right now is ventilators, where everyone's like, oh, we need ventilators and we need more ventilators. We need more factories that can make more ventilators because we can't keep up with demand. So what we actually see happening is, since there is such a large demand that just popped up, you see, I know GM and Ford are refitting some of their factories to be able to build ventilators, but we see stuff like that going on where our supply is being shifted to something that's more applicable for today. I also don't know how many people are going out and buying cars this week, or if you're allowed to go. I don't even know if car dealerships are open right now, but they're there. So we see that shift in that's going on today. But the key thing is, in the long run, uh, a lot of people are going to be on supply side. A lot of people are going to be more with the neoclassical mindset. Whereas in the short run, people may be more likely to, depending on economic conditions, people may be more likely to take a shift away from this and move into the other side, which is called demand side economics, or we're going to get into is called Keynes' law. So with Keynes, what they're saying is demand creates its own supply. So what we see here is they're saying, right, it's great, right? You can make whatever you want, but if say your athletics were playing athletics like major professional sports were playing right now, it's great that you supply it, but nobody would be able to go because in half the country, in like three-quarters of the country, it's illegal to have a group of more than 10. So what we're getting at here is, again, you can create all you want, but you have to have demand to be able to demand that good, or to be for that good to be sold. Somebody has to demand it. Somebody has to be able to afford it. Somebody has to want that good. So they kind of put that again. It's not necessarily what we supply, but how much do people demand? And this is a nice short run application. Um, right. So in the short run, we have times of booms, times of recessions. We have it where we have good, bad times. We have times where people are buying lots of goods. We have times where people aren't buying as much. So in the short run, it's a nice approximation. However, when we think about the long run, um, our economy actually does have limits. And we're seeing that right now in the production of ventilators, masks, and stuff like that. So in those cases, our demand has gone up extremely high for toilet paper, ventilators, and masks. However, our firms are only able to produce so much. So what we're seeing in a few markets right now is the demand can't keep up with the supply. So we're kind of seeing where Keynes' law doesn't really always necessarily work out 100%, right? And they both have shortcomings, but we're seeing that come in. The other side of this, though, is if demand was all that mattered. So suppose that Keynes' law was 100% there. If demand was the only thing that mattered, then we ought to just go out and break stuff, like break windows, break everything. Because if we break stuff, then that means we have to hire somebody to create a new glass, or we have to recreate whatever was destroyed, which uh, which would technically, yes, it would get $1 spent, but that dollar could have been spent somewhere else, and so on. So what this point kind of looks at, and something you can look into if you're interested in, is this idea of the broken window fallacy. Uh, and if you get the chance, look into it. It's an interesting idea um, that you can look into, and it's a fun, interesting idea. So what we see and what we're seeing right now is that we do actually face limits to how much we can produce. So we can't just come in and produce all these goods and expect people to, excuse me, we can demand all we want, but there is going to be a limit to how much factory space we have. There's a limit to how much labor we have, and to everything we have. There's that limit to what we're actually able to produce. So we have that going for us on the Kane side. And as we go through, towards the end of either today or sometime on Monday, we'll kind of look and see where people are more supportive of these ideas and where kind of where things are going with them. So on the other side of that, so getting into our actual model, we have a few definitions to go through, but that's all right. So we're starting out with is looking at exactly what it is that we're doing. So we're looking at this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And what this is going to show is the relationship between price levels versus our real GDP, or how many goods do we produce. And the difference between this and a regular demand and supply is that this is going to look across the entire economy and not just an individual good. So for the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we have kind of two fronts to this. The first is called aggregate supply. And what this looks at is how much quantity of output will firms produce and sell at every price level. Um, so this will, as you can imagine, be upward sloping. So the idea of this is if prices are too low, so if we think about any one individual good, right? If the price goes down, firms are going to produce less of that good. So if across the board price levels go down, there are going to be less firms willing to produce at that low price level. And our curve is just a curve that shows what we are looking at. So the other side, the part we have of this is called we call our potential GDP, and we'll kind of get into aggregate demand in a minute. We have our potential GDP, and what this looks at is how much can an economy produce. So it's this maximum quantity that economy can produce, given our full employment. So remember, when we're talking about employment, full employment does not mean 0% unemployment. It means somewhere between 4 and 6% unemployment. And this is given our existing labor, capital, technology, and institutions. And then another way to think of our potential GDP is also called full employment GDP. That is, what would our GDP be if we were at this potential GDP? So what we'll expect to see this look like is something like this. So we'll have our curve, and we'll have an aggregate supply look something like that. And when we think about our potential GDP, what we'll expect to see is it'll come in somewhere about here. And we'll have, again, our potential GDP or our full employment GDP. And when we look at our aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, what we'll see is on the y-axis over here, we'll have our price level. And we looked at this in chapter 22, or was it 20? Let me look. Yeah, that was in from chapter 22. And on the x-axis, we're looking at our y, which is our real GDP, which we covered back in chapter 20. Okay. So this aggregate and aggregate supplies really just going to bring all of our measurements in together and and just throw everything in together. And it's going to look really cool when we get towards the end of our chapter. So we have the start of our model, but at this point we're still missing our aggregate demand. So we want to introduce that and see what that looks like. And again, that just kind of writes out what I just wrote. But the other side of this again is aggregate demand. Now, this is going to look at is how much spending do we have on domestic goods and services in our economy. So to measure this, we're going to look at our consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Because if we remember, Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. So that's what we're looking at with aggregate demand. And then we have an aggregate demand curve that looks something like that. Again, it's just a curve that shows our aggregate demand. So what we're going to see happen, a couple things. So before I get into aggregate demand, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just highlight a couple things just looking at our aggregate supply. So something we're going to see in a few minutes, this potential GDP, we're going to break our aggregate supply down into two components. We're going to call this curvy one our short run aggregate supply, and this one that's this potential GDP, we're going to refer to as our long run aggregate supply. And what we're going to see happen is that in the long run, again, at our current productivity level, we are going to have a long run equilibrium right where our short run and our long run aggregate supply intersect. So if our economy was running in full capacity, we'd have an equilibrium right where these two intersect. And again, this is like our full output price level or full output GDP, really where we expect to be. However, once we get our aggregate demand in, and I'm going to go over so I line it up right. Once we get our aggregate demand in, what this is going to add in is a new kind of element. So we have our price level and our GDP. We'll have a short run aggregate supply. And I'm going to leave out potential for now, but I'm going to throw in aggregate demand, say right here. And I'll throw this down here. So where these two intersect, say right here, we're going to get a price level and an output. And I'm going to say that this is P, let's say PS and Y. No, let's not do that. Let's say it's, how do I want to phrase this? I'll just say PR and YR for realized. So when we look at these, what we're going to see is that we have PR and YR are going to be short run price level and output. And we may also think of these as what we actually realized in our economy. So we don't always live up in the perfect world of producing full output. Oftentimes we're producing something less than that. And that's what we're looking at here in this PR and YR. And again, what this will do is this will form a, let's scroll down a little bit. Let's scroll down a little bit more. So we're getting into, again, is a short run and long run aggregate supply. Again, our short run aggregate supply, like I kind of mentioned, it's that upward sloping curve that shows the relationship between price level and real GDP. On the other side, though, we have our long run aggregate supply curve. And again, this is the same thing as the potential GDP. And that's the same thing as our full employment GDP. So all three of these things are pretty much the same thing. But what a long run aggregate supply curve looks at is it's saying that what we're able to produce isn't actually dependent on the price level. And if we think about it in terms of like inanimate objects or your actual labor itself. So right now I'm using a computer. My computer does not care how much I get paid. It doesn't care how much electricity costs or anything like that. The only thing my computer cares about, which is nothing because it's an inanimate object, but the only thing my computer cares about is its battery charged, and that's really all it cares about. So it doesn't say, oh, well, how much do I have to pay for electricity or anything like that. Instead, it just says, hey, is my battery charged or no? If we think about any type of item, your car does not care how much gas is. You do, but your car doesn't. So your car is going to produce the same gas mileage. It's going to go the same speed, whether we have $10 gas or $1.59 gas. So just a couple things we'll note with our full employment long run aggregate supply versus short run. It's again just taking out that relationship between price level and real GDP. So when we put all of these together, what we end up seeing is a graph that looks something like this. Again, we have price level and output. We have our short run aggregate supply. We have our long run aggregate supply. We'll have aggregate demand come in somewhere around here. That's really what we see happening. So again, just to kind of illustrate everything I've written so far, we have kind of two equilibriums, and it could be the case, it could be very well be the case that aggregate demand comes in here. I just like to leave a little separation just to show kind of, where we want to be versus where we might be. So again, here is our long run equilibrium. And here is our realized, in green, we have our long run equilibrium. And in yellow here, we have our short run equilibrium. Our long run equilibrium, we may think about where we should be. And our short run, we might think about where we actually are. And that's what we see going on really in here. And again, in a few minutes, we'll go through and really just dissect everything, look at inflation, unemployment, and all that fun stuff. So we said PR and YR. But first, we want to look at what actually causes arch curves to shift. So first little bit looks at our aggregate supply. We're going to see is mainly two very important factors that actually cause our aggregate supply curve to shift. The first is our productivity growth, and this was from our chapter on growth. I think that was chapter 21. Yep. What? Nope. 20. Which means something up there that I said 24. Should have been 19. But productivity growth, we look at chapter 20. And remember, this looked at things like technology, human capital, physical capital, things like that. And the second bit we have is our changes in our input prices. So what happens to things like wages, raw materials, and other stuff like that. So what happens when materials become more expensive? Maybe utilities. I'm not going to worry about those right now. But things that I use to produce my good, what happens when prices go up for those? And they're going to make me less willing to produce a product. And we can also have unexpected shocks that can shift things around. So right now we're probably in one of these shocks to the economy where people can't work. Maybe they're being forced to quarantine right now. Maybe they're self-quarantining, whatever the case may be. But we may see those kind of things going on. More commonly, what we may see is something like a large-scale weather event where people have to, a large-scale weather event, or maybe a war overseas where people can't be here producing goods. Instead, they have to be either evacuating or fighting in a war, or whatever the case may be. But again, we're looking at that aggregate supply and really seeing what's going on there. So if we shift our aggregate supply, and over time, where is that one? Oh, so I'll introduce stagflation and then get into the next little bit. So in addition to these two things, one of the conditions that we can see, which really isn't not really good times, is this stagflation. And what this is telling us, basically, is that we experience this when our GDP is falling or staying the same, and our inflation is increasing. So before we talked about this time where we should expect to see our price if we are in a recession or something like that. Normally, yes, our GDP goes down, but inflation will not go up as much with it. When we're in stagflation, we're basically saying we have high inflation, high unemployment, and our demand isn't really changing much, or maybe our demand is falling. Whatever the case is, it is. But we'll see what stagflation looks like once we start playing with, or actually we'll look at stagflation right now. Why not? So when we get back into our chart, again, we'll have a price level and a GDP, price level, GDP. Oops. And we'll see our aggregate demand curve going down, something like that. Or actually, I'll put us in equilibrium. Why not? So we have our short run aggregate supply. Oops, short run aggregate supply looks something like this. We'll have our long run that looks something like, I'm not going to worry about long run actually right now. I'm just going to deal with the short run just to keep things clean. So short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So initially we're at a spot right here where we have our price level and our GDP. So when we experience stagflation, traditionally what we see, so on a normal day, or as we normally go through time, we're going to expect to see the aggregate supply curve shift to the right because we have improvements in technology. While wages may be increasing, you need less workers to produce goods. So these improvements in technology, improvements in productivity, and so on. So we're going to expect our aggregate supply curve to shift to the right over time. However, when we're in stagflation, And normally what ends up moving is the aggregate demand curve. So if aggregate demand curve shifts left, then prices go down, quantity goes down. Not our favorite situation, but we can deal with it. Similarly, if aggregate demand shifts left, or excuse me, if aggregate demand shifts to the right, we'll see our prices will go up, output will go up. So again, there's some trade-off there. But what happens? How can we end up in a spot where we have higher price levels and lower output? So if something happens where and this will be more of a long-term thing. It's not necessarily just oh, we had a virus and we had a virus for 2 weeks, so things are messed up. This is more potentially a long time thing, but we could expect to see our aggregate supply shift up, something like this. And if our aggregate supply is actually shifting back, that's like really bad times because it's like we're almost walking backwards. Productivity is actually going down and so on. And if this were to happen, if we were to tag in our long run aggregate supply, we would see that that would go down. Now, granted, this graph is probably a little on the dramatic side, but I think it gets the point across and how we can see that stagflation. And if we think about what this is saying in terms of technology and productivity, this means that we are becoming less productive, which again, as we can imagine, is really bad times. So that stagflation mainly comes from our supply curve shrinking back. And we kind of see what happens. Over time, we expect our supply curve to shrink out, to move out, but that's what we can see. So on the other side, we have shifts in aggregate demand. And this one can be a little, how do I put it? There are a couple things we can going on here. So when we think about a shift in demand, what's really going to cause it is some change in either consumption, investment, government expenditures, or net exports. So if anybody of these changes something, we're going to expect to see our demand change as well. So if we have a shift to the right, what this means is that at least one of, I don't know why I put an at sign there, but at least one component is increasing. So either consumers are spending more, firms are spending more money, government has increased spending, or we're producing more exports. And similarly, if we shift to the left, it means that again, at least one is cutting their spending. So at least one is going down. So when we think about what can actually really cause this, a lot of it is going to be caused, especially in the sense on the aggregate sense, a lot of it's going to be caused in consumer or producer confidence. Or again, there can be shocks where, like today, our personal spending has gone down fairly well because, our personal spending has gone down because there's not as much to do. You can't go see a movie, you can't go to a hockey game or a race or anything fun like that. So but in general, on normal days, if consumers are confident about the future, they'll consume more. So if I'm confident that, hey, we're going to make it out of this all right and everything's going to be good, I might be willing to go out and say, well, I might go out and spend more. Similarly, if I'm saying that, well, the future's bleak and everything's going to fall apart, I might say, you know what, I don't want to spend as much, so I'm going to keep more savings, and so on. And same thing with businesses. They're confident, then they'll spend more on their investments. And if our confidence is low, then consumption investment will decline. So when we shift aggregate demand, and the other side, okay. And the other side of this is our government spending. So if the government increases spending, again, as we can imagine, we'll shift to the right. And if government decreases spending, then we'll have a shift to the left, which the government can do just whenever they want to do, pretty much. But what this will look like, and it will look kind of like it, and what we'll see down the road is a little bit of a trade-off between consumer and government spending. But we'll get to that in a moment. So what we'll see happen is something like this. So again, we'll have our aggregate supply curve. And for now, I'm going to focus mostly on the short run. And suppose that we have our initial aggregate demand. So 81. And this will give us an initial price level and an initial output. So if we are confident about the future, right, we may say we're going to go out and buy more goods and shift that aggregate demand curve out to say 82. And what this will cause us to do is we will, as we can imagine, this will mean more goods get sold, so we have a higher GDP. And this will mean our price level also will increase. And similarly, if times are not so great and we're deciding not to spend, we may be down here at 83, which I'll label in red. And at 83, we'll see we have a relatively low output and a lower price level. So we see we have our increases, our decreases, and what we're going to see come up as we go through, and I'll come back to this for the interpretations, but we'll see come up is we kind of see a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and as well as we're going to throw in a little growth component in as well. We'll see that in actually right now. So when we interpret this, right, we have kind of three things to see from this. So our interpretations. And the first one's going to be unemployment. So with unemployment, so when we're looking at this, we're not going to find an unemployment rate. We're not going to figure out, exactly how many people are unemployed by using this model, but we can get a proxy for high or low unemployment based on output. So if I scroll back up really quick, right, I look at this graph. So I have my potential GDP right here, or my long run is right here. I already used gold, but oh well. So if I'm at, say, this high level of aggregate demand, we see that our productivity is very close to what we're able to produce. So at this point, we could say we have low unemployment. Again, we can't necessarily say what our unemployment rate is, but we can say it's low unemployment. Whereas if we're out here at Y3, you see where there's a lot of goods that we could produce that we're not. So out here, we're going to have an issue of high unemployment. Cool. So that's unemployment, right? How far, the question we can look at to figure out unemployment is how far are we from our potential GDP? The second bit that we can tell is inflation. And with inflation, we do get an exact measure, but how do price levels change? With the change in that same change in aggregate demand. Or we can even do aggregate supply, whichever works. So when we see inflation, we kind of see a couple things going on. But what we can do is, just like we did last week, or like we did on Monday, whatever it was, this can be found. Inflation will be the change in price level divided by the original price level, then multiply that by 100. And whatever our jump was, we can see. And we'll get into kind of where, right now I'm just looking at the interpretation themselves. We'll throw them together in a couple seconds. And then growth will tell us how many more goods are we producing than before. And this can be measured in two ways. The first way we can think about growth is how has our output changed, right? And this is more of a short run type deal. So we're saying, am I producing more goods than I did last year? So this first little bit of growth, right, just looks at if I go from Y3 to Y1, this would be considered growth, right? If I go from Y1 to Y2, that would be growth as well. And we can tell our growth rate by taking the change in our productivity, or change in output, divided by the original output times 100, same thing as the price level. But the second thing that we can do to tell growth is we can ask, can we produce more goods? And what this looks at is an increase in our long run aggregate supply, or potential GDP, right? So we see with this one is we're actually able to produce more goods. We're actually able to have more output, which again isn't necessarily the economy growing itself, but that increase in productivity can help us push up to that next level or to a higher productivity. So the big trade-off that we're going to see here, and I'm just going to draw a new graph, that way it's clean. So we have our short run aggregate supply that looks something like this, a long run aggregate supply somewhere down here, and aggregate demand. And I'm going to draw kind of two sets of aggregate demand curves. I'm going to do one down here, which I'll call 81 and 82. If you like those longer, they can be longer. Then I'll do one up here, say 84 and 83. And we just want to see what happens between the two. So we're going to start both these at 81 and 83. Then we'll move up to 82 and 84. So I have a price level, a second price level, a third price level, and a fourth price level. But then I also have an initial output, a second output, another initial output, and a fourth output. So what we can notice is when we're down here, so when we're at aggregate demand 1, we see that our unemployment is like very high, right? And what we see happen here is that we can experience large growth, or a large amount of growth, with relatively small inflation. So what we see happening here is between 81 and 82. We have this large little bit of growth, or what appears to be a large bit of growth, but our inflation is relatively small. So at this point, we might say, you know what, we're not really that much against policy that pushes out the aggregate demand curve, just because we get that nice big jump in productivity. We barely have to pay anything extra for our goods, and that makes us happy. That makes us where we want to be. However, if we're at 83, things are going to look a little different. So, oops, I want black, not gold. So if we're up at 83, we're going to see that our unemployment is relatively low, at least compared to 81. So in this case, what we see is that our growth, again, we can, switch that. So we see that our growth is, we just move up a little bit. So we have a relatively small amount of growth, but we have a relatively, maybe it doesn't look that much bigger, but it should be, we have a relatively large amount of inflation, or compared to how much growth we have a lot of inflation. So at 83, we experience inflation with just a small increase in output. Increase in output. And again, this isn't necessarily where we want to be. This isn't necessarily want to see, just because again, there's just that we're going to increase this aggregate demand, put out this extra policy, but now inflation is going to become a concern. And if inflation is a concern, that means things are getting expensive, and that's not really what we necessarily want to see. So we kind of have this trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and that brings us into our kind of our interpretation and kind of where our models really come into play. Um, and also, sorry, I forgot one little thing. So when we look at government policies, right, and we're going to see these as we go through the third unit, but a couple things that we'll see with these is, excuse me, a couple things we'll see with our government policies is that government has two choices, or has two really big decisions to make. Right. If you think they don't, pretty much their decisions come out to these two. So they can control their spending, and they can control their taxes, right? Or what tax they charge. So if our spending increases, this leads to an increase in government spending. But also, if our taxes increase, this will lead to a decrease in consumption and investment spending. That is, if I have to pay more taxes, I'm not going to go buy as much stuff. Or if a business has to spend more in tax revenue, they're not going to invest as much in their business because more of it has to go towards taxes. Similarly, if the government cuts their spending, then the government expenditures decrease. And if we cut taxes, this leads to an increase in consumption or an increase in investment, whichever one the tax cut is on. So these actions are two separate actions, right? So when we saw last week, we signed whenever we signed whenever we signed the coronavirus stimulus bill. When we signed that, we've put in this big increase in government spending, but within the bill itself, it never mentioned a tax increase, right? So the bill itself was not a tax bill; it was a spending bill. Last year, when they or not last year, in 2017 or maybe 2018, when they passed the new tax code, we saw a decrease in taxes, but the tax code itself didn't necessarily, and there may have been some areas where it covered government spending, but for the most part, the tax code itself only focused on the taxes, not the government spending. So these are two separate actions. But if we think about it, if we are spending more money, if that is the government increases spending, that spending has to come from somewhere. So theoretically, these two should be together. And also, if the government cuts spending, they don't need as much money. So theoretically, if they cut spending, they can also cut taxes. But as we go through, we'll kind of see some things that come up with that. So what this leads to, though, when we think about our aggregate demand, so we have our aggregate demand. And say we have an increase in government spending, that'll increase our aggregate demand up to, say, 82. But when the government increases their spending, this means that they theoretically have to raise taxes. So we may see a decrease in consumption or a decrease in investment. So that will, to some degree, kind of taper that increase in government spending. And it could taper it here, it could taper it all the way back. I tend to think that the government action is bigger than the consumption or the investment, because while if the government gets $1, theoretically they're spending it because they're a government. Whereas as a consumer, if I get $1,000, or if it works out that we get the $1,200 coming up, or for us it will be 2,400. But if that whole thing works out and we get it and it's there, we're not necessarily going to go out and spend all 12 or $2,400 of it, right? We may take some of it and spend it, but there's some of it that we as consumers are going to keep in savings, or we might put some of it away, or whatever we need to do, we can do. And there are multiple people that will put it away somewhere. So when the government puts out that $2,400 or 1,200, depending on whether you're married or not, and I guess depending also on your income. Um, but when they put out that money, not all of it is going to go straight into the economy, because I know we personally are going to put some of it to the side for uh, to help with like housing or stuff like that. So we have that, and similarly, if the government has a decrease in spending, we'll also see consumption increase, or our investment will also increase. So if the government has this decrease, they may go down to say 84, but that will be tapered slightly um, by consumption and investment. So increase in government spending gets tapered back. A decrease in government spending should get tapered up, because if the government cuts their spending, ideally they would also cut taxes some as well. So just some little intro on policies and kind of how that can taper, and kind of how things can work against each other a little bit. And that's not necessarily working against each other, but we'll see it as we go through. And we kind of talked about employment, growth, unemployment, all that good stuff already. So the last little bit for today, and the last little bit of this chapter, is going to look at some different zones and where people think in certain places. I'm going to do this on my own because I like to do this one on my own. So we have our aggregate supply curve. And again, I'm going to focus mostly on this one and long run. So again, we have short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply. And what we're going to see here is a few different zones, right? I'm going to switch this a little bit, make this a little more pronounced. There we go. That's what I wanted. So we're going to see here is kind of three different zones. And before I introduce them, I'm going to think about, suppose that you're, and suppose it's normal times, right? So we're not going through the drama we have now, where with coronavirus, and if you have and right, so it's normal times where we're not thinking anything extra about public health. It's just a regular day. We kind of have, and if you think about who goes to the doctor when, we kind of have three types of, we have like three types of people. Two of them are extreme. So you have one type of person who, and the assumption I'm making is that we're otherwise healthy. So I understand there's some people where, hey, they have to go to the doctor if they run even the slightest fever. I get that. Not really the people I'm referring to in this situation. But what we might see is three types of people. You have one who, the second they hit 100 degrees, and again, they're otherwise healthy, they're going to be in the doctor's office trying to figure out what's going on. Then we have people who won't go to the doctor. Then we have stubborn people who won't go to the doctor unless, pretty much unless they're on their deathbed, which, we have those people. We probably all know somebody like that. Then we have our middle group who says, I have a threshold. Maybe someone says if I hit 101, someone else might say if they hit a 102 fever. Different people might go in at different times, but everybody kind of has a threshold of how bad do I have to be to go to the doctor. So we're going to introduce in here, with our economy, is kind of three different zones. And we're going to see these, we're going to see kind of three different zones. And we're going to call them the Keynesian zone, the neoclassical zone, and the intermediate zone. And these are all going to be dependent on where the aggregate demand curve meets the short run aggregate supply curve. And in general, what I'm going to do is I'm going to color code them. Keynesian is red, neoclassical is green, and intermediate is yellow. So in general, we'll expect to see the Keynesian zone will be down here where inflation is, or where output is relatively low. Neoclassical will probably be up here where output is high, and our intermediate will be somewhere in the middle. And we're seeing here, if we're in the outright Keynesian zone, most people will be open to policy to increase our aggregate demand. Right? So this could come in the form of something like a stimulus, or this could be a tax cut, right? Whatever it is, it is. But if we're in this red zone, again, people are willing to have policy. So right now, again, right now is it's not a great time, but for the sake of this example, it's a convenient time. I'll put it that way. So right now, we might say we're somewhere in a matter of a couple weeks, right? Everything kind of shut down, and we went from being like here, say, to somewhere down here extremely quick. Now, if we were up, if it was, say, I don't know, January, like early January, before anything was really coming out about the virus, right? If we were up here, if anybody would have proposed a $2 trillion spending bill in the month of January, they would have been not thought of very fondly, because what we would have worried about then is having this huge increase in aggregate demand, which would have led to some pretty significant inflation. So when we're in the Keynesian zone, again, most people are going to be saying, you know what, it's all right to pass a spending bill. We're not going to complain about that. So spending bill, tax cuts, whatever we need to do, we want that aggregate demand up because unemployment is very high, production's very low, and that's where we want things to go. Again, the idea here is most people will be open. So what the Keynesian zone might be is if you're running 103-degree fever, most people, if they're running 103, 104-degree fever, are going to get into the doctor because that's like, it's dangerous. It's a dangerously high fever and so on. In the neoclassical zone, though, what we're going to say is that most people will probably be open to free market ideas. Will be more open to a free market econ. So we're seeing with in the neoclassical zone is this is when we're healthy, everything's good, we're all happy. And again, just like we said, just like I said like 2 seconds ago, if in January we had proposed a $2 trillion tax bill or a $2 trillion spending bill, people would have thought that I'm sure people wouldn't complain about getting $1,200 in the mail, but people would have found that rather odd. And as crazy as we think Washington is, we would have been saying they're a lot crazier for putting that kind of policy in that time. So in this time, we want policy that, again, we want to promote innovation. That way we can get this aggregate supply curve pushed out. But for the most part, what we see in the neoclassical zone is if I have a 98.6 temperature, I woke up today, I'm feeling great, and everything's going great, I'm probably not going to go to the doctor I'm probably not going to call in sick. I'm not going to go to the doctor unless I have a physical already scheduled, but I'm not going to go into urgent care when I'm feeling fine. Right? That's what we see in the neoclassical zone. But where most of our debate is in this intermediate zone. And the intermediate zone, we have, as you can imagine, we're between the neoclassical and the Keynesian. And at least in my mind, this intermediate zone is really where all of our uh, it's really where all of our conflict lives, right? Whenever we have an argument over the economy or whatever the case is, oftentimes it's going to live right in this intermediate zone. And the reason for this, uh, and we're kind of seeing, and we may, so earlier I said we were down here, we may be somewhere right here or even right here in terms of intermediate zone. Because within society right now, you do have people who are, you have people who are in full, they're in full coronavirus mode, but then you have others who are a little more like not like overly concerned about it. You have some people who are still just, they're living as much normal as they can. Then you have people who are uh, to the most extreme hunkered down. So you kind of have everybody kind of taking different approaches to it. And even with the stimulus package that was passed last week, you have different mindsets of was it a good deal or not, or was it a good piece of legislation? Um, and some people will say, well, was it time to? Is it necessarily early enough to pass a piece of legislation like that? And there's a lot of there is debate over stuff like that. And that's where the intermediate zone really comes in. So if we were for sure in a depression, right, all the way down here, most people would say, you know what, yep, pass what you need to pass. If we were in our happy zone, our neoclassical zone, people might be watching Washington a little bit, maybe a little more scrutinous. But excuse me, people would not really be desiring a stimulus package or anything like that because they're fine. But when we're in this intermediate zone again, this is where we have our debate. Are we in a recession? Are times really as bad as we think they are? Or, what's going on? So intermediate zone again, that middle zone. Uh, this is the fun part again, where our debate is. And one of the big reasons this would be where our debate is so if we have aggregate demand up here and we increase our aggregate demand, right? We pass a new policy up here. When we're way down in the dumps, and if we do that same increase, we're not going to see a big jump in inflation. But with these two, what we can kind of see happen, and I'm hoping this works the way I want it to. It might. I don't know. We'll see. I'm hoping this works the way I want it to. So if we're up here in this intermediate zone, if we have just a small increase in, here, I'm going to scooch this. This is going to look cool. So when we're here in the intermediate zone, oops, there we go. If we have a small increase, or if we're just a little bit off from where we think we are, we can see some major inflation issues. However, if we are, say, a little bit behind where we are, we may see very small inflation issues. So when we're in this intermediate zone, it's where the debate is. But part of the reason the debate is there is because, we don't, we are not 100% precise. And if we are off, or if we overstimulate the economy, we may run into an issue. This could lead to an issue with inflation, which again would be an issue with inflation. Sorry. So again, and that's not really where we want to be. We want our inflation to be steady. We want it to be relatively low and working well for us. So kind of the three zones where stuff comes in. As we go through the third unit, we'll see a couple issues that also comes up in terms of policy. Another thing that can come up is some lag issues. But as we get through, we'll see benefits and disadvantages of policy and so on. In general, what we're going to see, especially as we get into our policy, is that almost everything we see is going to have a trade-off. But that's just one of the fun parts about economics is figuring out how much of a trade-off do we want to have. So that's our chapter on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Stick around and I'll kind of talk about the exam a little bit for you all.